The Inca were the dominating force in the Andes region, but how did they get there, and how were they able to gain and maintain that control? In this lecture, we will be covering the Inca government and military, and we'll discuss how these two forces were able to enforce social control. There is no single reason why this happened, nor is there any single explanation why the Inca grew rapidly and suddenly into a major imperial power, although many have attempted to explain. The reasons break down into categories of conflict and competition, internal and external transformations, demographics, environmental factors, the quest for wealth, and ideological factors which at one point or another were in the Inca's favor. In this lecture, we're going to be covering what is known and understood of how Inca society and government were organized. So what do we know? Well, the Inca came to power after the collapse of Tiwanaku and the Wari. The fall of these civilizations created an environment of mini-states and chiefdoms which were independent and competing for superiority. By the 14th century, the Inca were simply one of many, so it is curious how and why they rose to dominate. Now, the official rise is not known, but it does exist in myth and the legendary founding of Cuzco, as well as the war against the Chanca. So then, what allowed the Inca to rule so much territory so quickly? Well, it all boils down to religion. The Inca imposed their religion on all subjects, thus unifying the groups. Inca religion infused a high degree of superstition, compelling people to follow. And one way they were able to do this was through the Capacuacha or the Capacocha ceremony, which was the Inca practice of human sacrifice, mainly incorporating children. Now, it was a religious obligation and was used to blur the distinctions between fear, duty, privilege, and power. You're going to be learning more about the Capacocha in a future lecture, so hang tight on that one. Another means of promoting unification was through reciprocity. Reciprocity was a means of establishing order in a system that did not use money. It essentially regulated relationships between groups of people and was used to maintain socioeconomic ties. It truly was a conquest strategy in that it could avoid military aggression. For example, the Inca would offer lavish gifts to a local chief whose territory they wished to annex. If denied, that's when the Inca went to war. While reciprocity was usually the first step in gaining a territory, once a territory was annexed to the Inca government, they became incorporated into a tribute system. Essentially, the Inca government extracted goods and services from provinces organized in the form of a tribute payment. While land and transportable property were extracted at the time of annexation, the principal contribution was labor service, which could mean either permanent, which means you left your home forever, or temporary, meaning that you would return home after a designated amount of service. If permanent, the service passed on to the next of kin from parent to child. Inca civil administration primarily functioned as a means to organize and distribute the labor obligation requested of the provinces. Labor assignments varied greatly and included, for example, service as gold and silver miners, masons, guards, honey gatherers, dye makers, cultivators of coca, hunters, herders, and soldiers. These populations of laborers were organized according to the decimal system and divided into units of 10, 50, 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000. Other civil administrative functions included the religious system, which too was a hierarchy and provided the religious backbone of the empire. Now, the military was also key to maintaining civil administration. Soldiers were fielded from peasant farmers and were part of the labor obligation. The entire military supported and was supported by the Sapa Inca, who was the principal king and commander, as well as chief of the military. The previous slide covered the basics of civil administration of the empire, but how was it organized socially? The most prominent organization in the empire was the Ayu. Ayus were a kin-based community acting as a collective or corporate entity. Now, all Ayus were patrilineal and endogamous, from which descent from a common ancestor was essential. They collectively owned territory and shared water rights, as well as reciprocal obligations and labor burdens. For example, Ayus provided the work groups for the local chief or Karaka. Now, several different ayus would compose a town or village and were subdivided into two moieties, the Hanan and the Hurin. The Inca capital of Cuzco, as well as most chiefdoms, were also divided into two halves. One upper half called the Hanan and one lower half called the Hurin, so very much so similar to the ayus. The Hanan and Hurin divided the urban plan of Cuzco into equal upper and lower halves that separated royal kinship groups. You have to think of it more as a spatial division, with each half being ruled by a chief. What half you resided in depended on the age of your kin group. For example, older kin groups resided in the Hanan. Now, the Hanan and Hurin functioned essentially as a diarchy, wherein two kings or chiefs ruled simultaneously. Outside Cuzco, the Inca organized their cities and settlements according to these same principles established at Cuzco. Within both halves were various different social classes. The three basic classes were the elite and nobles, the caracas, and the commoners. There were also a number of other groups that do not fit into these categories but were simply referred to as special classes. The highest rank in Inca society were the elite and nobles. At the top was the Sapa Inca, who was the head Inca king and chief of the military. Next in line were the royal family and the Panacá, who were the descendants of deceased kings. At the bottom of this rank were the non-royal ethnic Incas, who were lower-ranking elite distinguished by lineage. Now, non-royals could achieve this status through military service, public role, or wealth. Now, as the empire expanded, so did the social hierarchy. This was so that they could assimilate pre-existing social patterns in an attempt to accommodate the stresses of rapid expansion. Thus, social class was considered very fluid. For example, a commoner might achieve elite or noble status of a low rank by gaining wealth or through performance in war. However, no matter your achievements, in Cuzco, only the aristocracy and royal kin were allowed to live within the city, with higher ranked nobles living close to the city but not within. The second class we have were the caracas, which was a hereditary class, meaning it was inherited. As a class, the tradition of the caraca had long been established in the Andes, extending back nearly 1,500 years. Basically, a caraca equated to a governor or a chief and was responsible for his subjects' well-being, as well as an intermediary between the cosmos and the forces on Earth. In Inca society, several categories of commoner existed according to their status and the functions they performed. So you've got artisans, who were the craftspeople responsible for things like pottery and textiles. Then you have the Hatun Runa, which constituted the majority of the Andean civilization, and it was comprised of adult males and their families who worked as peasant farmers or herders, but were also soldiers. Now, each Hatun Runa would typically have a representative, usually somebody of a caraca status. Now, the Inca also had a fisherman class who did not own land and were allocated to a very special ayu. Then you also have the Yana Kuna, who were considered servants in waiting for nobility. Additionally, there were the Mitmakuna, who were the families removed by the state from their place of origin and sent to fulfill specific tasks or missions. They were typically sent by their own local chiefs or caraca. Now, the Akyas were young girls, usually between 8 and 10 years of age, who were taken from their homes and sent to live in the house of chosen women. They enjoyed a privileged status and learned how to make high-quality textiles and preparations of ritual beverages like chicha, but they also served as wives for nobility. Typically, they were selected for their beauty and their aptitude. Now, the highest rank of Akya were the Mama Kunas, who were also called the Virgins of the Sun. The Mama Kuna never married and oversaw the young Akyas. As I mentioned, there were also special classes. Now, take note of this. The special classes were all ranked above commoners. So within this category were Incas by privilege, which were persons of non-Inca ethnicity that were selected by a ruler to perform a service or a task. They also held a wide range of administrative positions, thereby raising their status. Also included here were the local administrators, who were the governing class and helped with a wide range of jobs, from managing state income to supervising the artisans. Now, administrators enjoyed privileges above commoners, yet were also subject to extraordinary scrutiny and the threat of removal. Additionally, priests also fell into this category and were responsible for maintenance of the ritual and ceremonial aspects of the temple. Now, finally, there were the traders who lived along the coastline. Their status was equated to the wealth of the item that they traded. So, those who traded in spondylus shell, for example, held the highest status because of its great magical religious importance in the Andean world. Here is just a visual representation of the Inca social pyramid. So basically what social pyramids do is they show you by volume different social classes within a society. So for example, the Sapa Inca is a singular person, so he's at the very top, the smallest portion of the pyramid. So as you follow that down, you can actually see the ranking within social classes. So Sapa Inca at the top, followed by elites and nobles, then Caracas, then those special classes, and then the commoners at the bottom. And obviously that's the bigger portion of the pyramid because there's more commoners than there are elites and nobles. So speaking of the Sapa Inca, how did the Sapa Inca become the Sapa Inca? And who were all of the Sapa Incas in the Inca Empire? Well, early lines are actually really, really hard to trace. The earliest rulers, so before the Inca were established, were likely Sinchis, who were war leaders who combined military and political aptitude to take over areas, and likely over time they installed their sons to the throne. Now, the standard dynastic Inca lists mentions between 11 and 13 kings, with the first 7 kings being a mixture of history and legend. So much of what we know comes from the chroniclers and stories passed down over generations. But beginning with the 8th king, Viracocha Inca, the dynastic line becomes concrete. And what do we know of this dynastic line? Well, first we know that they practiced split inheritance. Split inheritance was a Pan-Andean tradition established during the Chimu Empire, from which the Inca took the idea. Basically, the crown and authority to rule were passed from the deceased king to his successor, but all of the king's material property, palaces, and land were given to the Panaka. Thereby, the successor would be privilege rich, but property poor. This caused the new ruler to acquire his own wealth, and typically he had 2 different options. One, he could increase tax revenue by demanding additional periods of service, or 2, he could conquer new territory, annex them to the empire, and then impose taxes on the new inhabitants. This type of inheritance is thought to be the driving force in the rapid expansion of the Inca Empire. Now, even after the death of a king, he was still very powerful. The Panaka served as the dead king's court and continued to treat him as though he were alive. They maintained his mummy and brought him to state ceremonies. His presence remained a state interest, demanding vast expenditures through offerings and sacrifices. With his mummy being one of the most important sacred objects in the empire, it helped to further along this ancestral cult. As I mentioned, in life, one of the king or Sapa Inca's primary roles was as the ruler and commander of the Inca military. The following slides will cover the structure of the Inca military and cover some warfare strategies. Most of what we know about warfare comes from the 16th century chroniclers, who were mostly soldiers that engaged with the Inca. Now, their accounts should be read with caution, as they were likely to portray themselves as the hero, because why not? Warfare for the Inca was largely an offensive operation. Basically, they took the fight to the enemy. They were very organized, as they had to mobilize tens of thousands of soldiers and thousands of auxiliary personnel for wars which could last months or even years. The Inca military had its own means of organization, and at the top obviously was the Sapa Inca, who was the commander-in-chief and on occasion a field general. Next in line were officers, who were usually royal kin, who would report back to the king. Then typically there were 2 to 4 commanders who would be responsible for leading a campaign, and using the decimal system I mentioned earlier, they would organize their men. Chroniclers mentioned that they followed a dual command structure, very reflective of the Hanan and Huron structure itself. Now, creating the actual army would take time. Word was usually sent out via the regular administration administrative structure to local lords who would then mobilize the required numbers of men. All married males between the ages of 25 and 50 were summoned. Now, unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25 were also called up, but to bear messages and travel with cargo. Women and children at first went to the campaigns, but this was later changed as it proved to be distracting. Typically, men were called away for months at a time, but as the empire expanded, it could be up as high as a few years. Now, you have to understand there was a lot of ethnic diversity in these armies, which created problems due to things like language barriers, so they used translators on the field. Now, army training began in youth in the form of ritual battles and training in martial arts, and you basically got to think of it as a way to preview who would be the best warriors. Now, strength in numbers was key to their success, so they could have campaigns of as large as 100,000 men. And for example, Tupac Inca was actually said to have fielded as many as 250,000 men. So again, what we know of uniforms comes from the chroniclers. So it's said that captains and generals wore colorful tunics and feathered helmets, while soldiers wore a long cloth or shawl. Soldiers from each ethnic group wore distinctive regional gear for identification, but regardless, they would all wear their most attractive and rich adornments, including things like jewels, as well as gold and silver plates, which would cover their chest and back. Now, what about armor? Typically, armor was constructed of wood slats made of chancha palm and cotton, and arms were protected with square or round shields of wood. Again, shields were commonly wood covered with deerskin or sheet metal and decorated with a hanging cloth painted with an emblem. Here are a couple examples of military uniforms. The left image is a modern artistic interpretation of what warriors would have looked like, whereas the right are actual drawings from an early chronicler showing battle uniform and dress. Military weapons commonly included arrows, sling stones, bolas, javelins, maces, clubs, and spears. Now, the most popular weapon was a club with a circular head made of either stone, copper, gold, or silver, and this head had 6 projections. Commonly, this kind of weapon was referred to as a star-headed mace. Now, each ethnic group typically had its own specialized weaponry. For example, the Kolyas were specialists in the use of the bola, while coastal people used mostly darts and spears. Here are a few archaeological examples of some of these weaponry. So you might be asking yourself, what the heck is a bola? Well, have a look at the upper right-hand image. A bola is made of 3 stones tied to cords united into one long cord. These were swung above the head and were thrown and used to entangle the legs of men. Now, the bottom images are those of a star-headed mace, the most popular weapon of choice for the Inca. So, how were these military campaigns staged? One important element was the provincial center. These centers were located away from Cusco and served governmental, religious, and military purposes. They were strategically placed, usually at intersections of natural conduits or adjacent to open valleys or plains, and this was thought to reduce the chance of a rebellion. They had many advantages, as an army staging ground, a place to advance from or withdraw to, as well as a visual signifier of the Inca domain, among many others. An important feature of all provincial centers was the Cayanca. The Cayanca was a large rectangular open plan enclosure constructed with both stone and adobe that provided the barracks for the soldiers. Another important feature of military campaigns were fortifications or forts. Forts were mostly located in frontier and border regions as well as the highlands. Forts are mostly found in northern Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, but were absent from the Cusco Valley. This was because Cusco was a defensible location. Defense was in mind with many constructions of the Inca, so think of Machu Picchu, which was a ritual place, but could be easily converted to a defensive location if needed. The Inca employed various types of conquest, including plundering, which was very common during the late Intermediate period and the beginning of the Late Horizon. The objective was to basically seize enemy goods, but it also had the benefit of instilling fear. Another type was reciprocity, which we covered earlier and involved an exchange of goods. And finally, there's civil conflict or retribution. So instead of offering Inca generosity, local lords would reject assimilation and fight the Inca, which they usually lost. Before a battle could begin, special ritual preparations needed to take place, since religion was very much so interwoven with warfare. In fact, religion was used to justify Inca conquest, as they believed their religion was the highest and purest form of religion, and thus it was their duty to spread it. Numerous rituals were performed before and during war to ensure victory. For example, soldiers would carry battle stones to ensure their protection. Battle stones could be painted or carved with images of things like snakes, birds, toads, or jaguars. Now, additionally, they also performed something called the Itu ceremony whenever a king was actually going to go to war. For the Itu, everyone in Cusco would refrain from sex and fasted for 2 days. Following that, women with dogs and all other animals had to leave the Cusco city, and images of gods were brought to the main plaza, where 2 llamas and sometimes children were sacrificed. Now, furthermore, they also used divination to help find out the outcome of the battle. In addition to ritual preparation, the Inca were also logistically prepared. The Inca road system, in fact, was designed to facilitate the movement of large forces. Now, along these roads were tambos, or way stations, which served as a refuge for soldiers. Now, what aided the military the most was the vast supply of state storehouses called colcas, which stockpiled enormous amounts of food, arms, and clothing. And with the aid of llama caravans, they were able to transport these goods back and forth and keep their soldiers supplied, fed, and prepared for battle. The military was originally concerned with extending borders, annexing territory, and asserting control over new populations. The primary plan was to use intimidation to avoid conflict, basically by coercing surrender. The king would send negotiators to explain the advantages of joining his empire, which often worked. And in fact, the ninth king Pachacuti and his son Tupac are thought to have established most of the empire by using this strategy. Now, when coercion and intimidation didn't work, they would have to go to battle. And the tactics or battle plans were based primarily on information gathering, planning ahead, and large numbers of men, as well as asserting a point of attack. The king would first send out reconnaissance missions in advance to survey the battlefield. Following this, clay models of the terrain were made, probably in order to decide the most effective means of deploying troops. Now, battle formation was organized by ethnic group, making language barriers less of an issue. Now, the favorite tactic of the Inca military was to fake a retreat, then flank the opposing side. If the surprise attack was successful, which it usually was, demoralization of the enemy was then the key to victory. Demoralization was accomplished by capturing the leader or the idol of the enemy, which was typically sometimes a stone. This speaks loudly to the importance of the supernatural among all of the different varying Andes groups. Once the leader was captured, he would be killed, and his skull would be lined with gold and used as a drinking cup. So, yeah, the Inca did not negotiate once a war was initiated. As such, the Inca did not take prisoners of war. That is, commoners were of basically no importance. Sometimes they were used to show off prestige by taking them back to Cusco, where they were laid in front of the Temple of the Sun, after which the king would symbolically walk all over them. And sometimes bothersome captives might be sacrificed, but most often prisoners of war were simply sent back to return to their daily lives, although they were now subject to Inca rule. Now, after a successful conquest, elaborate ceremonies were held, and gifts like clothing or gold pendants were awarded to soldiers. And if a soldier was well liked by the king, he may be awarded an administrative post, a gift of land, or even a wife. Now, following the ceremony, the army was disbanded. Well, that is, until the next war.